Yes, would you ask Ms. Wray to come back in, please? Thank you. All right, Ms. Wray, you ready to carry on?
Yes.
Good. Thank you very much. Yes, Mr.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Wray, before the lunch break, we were looking at TMO 00870-171. If you could just have that back up on the screen, please. This is the document we looked at, dated December 2009, entitled Fire Safety Policy. Take it from me that there's no reference in it to fire risk assessments, appointing a fire safety assistant, fire prevention, general fire precautions, dangerous substances, training of staff, or cooperation or coordination with other responsible persons. I'm right, am I, in thinking that this document, so far as you're familiar with it at all, doesn't purport to implement the Salvage recommendations?
It doesn't,
No.
you're quite correct.
Can we look then at TMO 00870-933? I just want to ask you about what this is. It's a document entitled Fire Protection Systems Policy and Procedure, latest working document, 10th February 2012, version 7. Are you familiar with this document?
Yes, it was drafted by John Bora, who's the Policy and Compliance Officer, who was based in the Asset and Regeneration, the technical division. I think there were various versions of it.
Right. This one was signed off by the Health and Safety Committee, as you can see from the box, in
Yes.
June 2012. Did you have any input into its production?
Very little, I should think.
Right.
John was based in the technical division, and he had ready access to the contracts management team, so presumably he would have worked with them to put this together.
I see. You can see from the box that versions 1, 2 and 3 are drafted, or rather authorised, by AD, AI&E, and then D, AI&E. Who is AD and D?
I'm guessing it could be assistant director.
Or director?
Well, yeah.
Okay.
Assistant director. I'm assuming AD is assistant director and D is director. And AI&E were Assets, Investments and Engineering,
Right.
which was the name of the Assets and Regen division before it got changed.
Before it got changed to
Assets and Regeneration.
Regeneration.
Yeah.
I see. Do you know who finally approved it? It says signed off by H&S committee. Who was it who signed that off?
Don't know really.
Right.
It would have just been wafted in front of the Health and Safety Committee at some stage, but I don't really recall, to be honest.
Right. Underneath the how did this document relate to the fire safety policy dated December 2009 that we've seen? Or can you not help us with that?
I think they're entirely separate.
Right. Was this policy and procedure created in response to Salvage's recommendations to create policies and procedures to maintain fire safety systems?
It may be one of the. It may be one of the documents that John was putting together as part of his input into that.
Right. I see. Now, can we look, please, at TMO 008999327? This version is dated January 2017, and this is version 8, as you can see. And this was last updated in June 2012. So it goes from 2012 to January 2017.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the next one on.
Okay.
Do you know what... first, do you know why this document wasn't updated between 2012 and 2017?
No, sorry.
Do you know why it wasn't reviewed in June 2013 as version 7 suggested it should be?
No, I don't know that either.
You don't. Do you know what prompted this document to be updated? What caused it to be updated at that point, January 2017?
I can only suggest that it might be because at that stage we were reviewing the strategy document, the fire safety strategy document, and that may have prompted John to resurrect anything else that he had.
Can you help us with why, although the date of this document is 10th January 2017, it was going to be reviewed by May 2017, only 5 months on from that?
Sorry, I can't.
Right. You can see that you were the person who authorised this document.
Yes.
You sound puzzled. Why is that?
Just because it would normally be signed off by the Health and Safety Committee and not just by me.
Well, it appears to have been signed off just by you. We've taken it that you were responsible for this document. Is that wrong?
Yeah, that's wrong. It was largely drafted by John in consultation with his technical colleagues, and at that point he would normally have come to the Health and Safety Committee for approval, and
Right.
I would not normally sign off somebody else's documentation on my own. That's not my style.
I just want to ask you one specific question about the differences between version 7, which was June 2012, and version 8, January 2017. Can we have both up at the same time, please? So we've got this one, which is this document. Can we have version 7, TMO 008700933? And I just want to go to page 2 of each document under paragraph 1.2. And under 1.2, you can see that there is a list of planned preventative maintenance service visits carried out as follows. And if you look at the 2017 version, you can see that there is a reference to the automatic opening vents as the last item there. You see that?
Yes.
Frequency as agreed, and that's absent from the 2012 version. Do you know why this was added to the fire protection systems procedure in 2017 only?
No, presumably because it should have been in the previous one, and for reasons I don't understand and can't explain, it wasn't.
Well, thank you. The next question was the AOV not a significant omission from the previous drafts of this policy?
Yes.
Yeah. Can I then turn to the document you referred to earlier on this morning, which was your November 2013 fire safety strategy? And I'd like to start the history of that document, please, with CST 401187. Now, this is an email dated the 18th of January 2013, in which you send a draft copy of something called a fire safety policy draft, Sept 2012, to Carl Stokes. And you say to him, attached is a very, very rough draft of this, and I'd be really grateful for your comments. Specifically, what else should I include? Are there areas where more detail is required and other appendices to be included, etc.? The last page is a brain dump of other things I maybe should include. What do you think? Really appreciate your help with this, as I'm sick of the sight of it. And then there's something personal in the last line. You can see from the attachments that it's saved as a draft September 2012. The attachment is at CST 402046. If we look at that, please. You've referred to the document as a fire safety policy, but in fact it's entitled TMO Fire Safety Strategy. Yes. Do I take it that there was no substantive distinction between calling it a policy or a strategy?
No, I probably hadn't just made my mind up at that time. Sorry.
No, very well. Did you draft this document to address one of the failings, or more than one of the failings identified by Salvage in their September 29?
Yes, I did.
Yes?
Yes.
You did. And was it intended, do you know, to replace or update the December 2009 fire safety policy signed by Robert Black we saw earlier, or can you not help us, given your ignorance of that document?
I think when I've been pondering the document that you showed me, I wonder if that was my embryonic start at pulling together a safety strategy document that then got parked in view of other work. I can only assume that was the case. I don't think that was ever adopted. So this would have been to replace that, obviously.
Right. Now, for the purposes of drafting this document, do you recall whether you referred to any particular policy documents, such as, for example, the LGA guide, which was by then about a year old, or the sleeping accommodation guide?
I thought I would have mentioned the LGA guide. I may or may not have mentioned the sleeping guide. I'm not sure.
Did you seek the advice or guidance from the RBKC Health and Safety Advisor when you were drafting this document, or anyone within their department?
I don't believe so.
Did you seek help only, therefore, from Carl Stokes?
From my colleagues, I think the email that you showed me was sent to Adrian and Cyril, my colleagues.
It was.
But I would have also consulted widely in the operations division because I was trying to reflect the practices that they had in terms of inspections and maintenance and all of the other areas that were under their control.
Right.
But I'm sorry, just one last thing. And I may have consulted the fire brigade on specific aspects of it, or if I was looking to be clear that we were adhering to their standards.
Right. Now, we know that Carl Stokes replied with his comments to you, as we can see from this document, and he did so on the 1st of February 2013. We don't need to go to the email. Okay. It is, for reference purposes, that's CST 3030180. Do you know what happened to this draft document after Carl Stokes had returned his comments to you on 1st of February 2013?
I don't, other than if it's in a more finalised version, I may have sought comments from my line manager, comments from other people whose any changes he's made, if they've impacted on other people's work. I don't know, sorry.
Right. I just want to pick up one thing in this document for the time being, if I may. Mm-hmm. Can we please go to page 13 and go to paragraph 24? Fire procedures. I'll read it to you. Staff who are not fully able-bodied and who may need assistance to be alerted to the fire alarm and or require assistance to evacuate from the office are required to have a personal emergency evacuation plan, PEEP. The H&S team will meet with the individual and together they will complete a pro forma clarifying their specific evacuation procedure. In some cases, this involves the use of a lightweight evac chair and training of staff in its use, and any additional assistance they will be provided, etc. The PEEP will be reviewed on a regular basis, and when the need/ability of the individual change in any way, a copy of the PEEP pro forma is at Appendix 9. That's page 33. Now, we'll come back to that in due course, but it looks from this document as if it attracted no comments from Carl Stokes. That's right, isn't it?
Doesn't appear to have, no.
No. Now, we'll come back to that, as I say. Can we then move on into 2013 and go, please, to TMO 100002648? These are the minutes of a meeting of the Assets and Regeneration and Repairs Health and Safety Group of the 18th of April 2013. And you are there, as you can see, yes, from the end of the first line of those present, yes?
Yes.
Now, this group, where did that sit within the TMO's structure of committees, groups?
So I think it dates back to shortly after we commissioned Salvage, when we were generating fire risk actions. Initially, I was meeting with managers of the teams who were receiving the actions on a sort of fortnightly or monthly basis to try and chivvy them along and make sure that they were completing the actions in the required time frame. I think that group then became more kind of formalised, and because they were operational people mostly, in relation to repairs and contracts management, the Assets and Regeneration and Repairs Health and Safety Group was formed, and I believe John Bora chaired that group as their compliance and policy manager.
What happened to that group?
I don't actually know, to be honest. I'm wondering if once we got a workflow, which was imminently due, it came in the 1st of August 2013, that actually we were able to provide them with much better information consistently. And then actually the Operations Health and Safety Group started at about the same time. So I think it got superseded by
I was going to ask
events,
you
really.
whether this mutated in part, at least, into the Operations Committee. Right, I see. Now, can I ask you to look at page 3, please? Item 7.1, Fire Safety Policy. And this is under the heading Risk Assessment Progress Update, Fire Risk Assessment Progress Update. This fire safety policy being drafted, nearly completed, will include inspection frequency, evacuation strategy, how we deal with lessee doors, etc. You see that?
Yes.
Now, do you recall a discussion on that subject?
I don't recall it, but we very likely would have had one.
Right. And the fire safety policy, is that the document which had come back to you from Carl Stokes on the 1st of February 2013, we saw earlier?
Yes, sorry, I obviously keep interchanging the language, which isn't very helpful, but yes.
But that right, I see. Now, then let's look, please, at later in the year, TMO 100004726. This is a set of minutes of the Operational Health and Safety Committee meeting of the 15th of November 2013. You are present, second item down. And you can see some other names from the Assets and Regeneration Repairs and Health and Safety Group earlier in the year. But by now, can we take it that the Operational Health and Safety Group was up and running?
Yes.
Yes. And if you go, please, to page 6 and look at the last bullet point under AOB, that reads, Fire Safety Policy. We need to provide the LFB with our policy in mid-December. Janice will circulate the draft policy and would welcome feedback in advance of this deadline. Is the draft policy the document that you'd sent to Mr. Stokes in the January of that year and had got back from him on the 1st of February with the yellow and green highlighting?
It would seem so.
Yes. Did you in fact circulate a draft or the draft policy before that time?
I probably circulated it several times because it was in preparation for far too long, as you can see.
Right. Do you remember what the document was that you were looking at this meeting, or referring to at this meeting? Was it the one that Mr. Stokes had sent back to you in February, or had there been further changes to it since then?
I believe there would have been further changes to
Right.
it.
Do you know when those had been made, or what they said, or what the...
Sorry, I don't off the top of my head.
We haven't seen, I think, any of those. Do you remember getting any feedback from this meeting on that draft, assuming it to be the same document, or substantially the same document?
It's likely that they would have taken it away, and I would have had any comments back by separate email.
Right. All right. Then let's go to the strategy itself. This is at TMO 00830598. This is the document we looked at earlier on this morning.
Yes.
And on page 15, it has November 2013 and your name at the bottom. Is this the document that was referred to at the Operational Health and Safety Committee meeting on the 15th of November, do you think?
Probably.
Do you remember whether you received any comments on the substance of this document from the members of the Health and Safety Committee, the Operational Health and Safety Committee?
I don't know. I don't know is unfortunately the answer, but there's clearly quite a lot in here about neighbourhood inspections and such like. So I would have had to be clear that what was in here reflected their working practices.
Right.
So if I didn't get feedback, I would have been chasing them just to confirm that this was an accurate reflection of what they were doing.
Do you remember whether you based it on the rough policy document you'd sent to Carl Stokes in January and he'd come back to you on the 1st of February?
Probably.
You don't recall?
No,
do you remember starting from scratch after February 2013?
No, that was my working document. It may have changed many times subsequently, but yeah, it was based on that.
Right. And when drafting it, what materials did you work from or refer to, do you think? We've got the last page there, but go back to the first page, if we would, please.
So I know that there were some appendices. I think, did we append the ESA checklist and such like?
Yes, well, if you go to page 15, well, page 16, you are right that is Appendix 1. Just pop that up, page 16. Estate staff inspection checklist, that's Appendix 1, so that was appended.
Yes.
You drafted that, I assume. Did you?
I didn't draft the original, but I added to it and reviewed it and worked with Martin Barr, their estate services team leader.
Right.
Okay.
Was it this document that you gave to Nick Cummery of the LFB at the bi-monthly meeting?
Yes.
In December?
Yes,
it was. Did the LFB comment on that?
No,
They
actually,
didn't.
never came back to me.
Just for reference purposes, that's LFB 50987, page 2, item 9. There's no need to turn it up, given your crystal clear recollection of it. Can I then ask you about the next Operational Health and Safety Committee meeting on the 17th of January 2014? TMO 00840384. First page, third bullet, minuted, fire policy. Michael and Janice will meet to discuss any changes. Janice informed the group that the fire brigade have already been given the draft. However, the finalised version can be signed off at next month's meeting. Had the fire safety strategy that we saw not been approved by this time, or had it been approved?
It had. Can I just clarify? So Michael was only recently appointed. He was the Repairs Direct Health and Safety Manager. And
that's Michael Lyons?
Yes, that's right. And I had already signed it off and, as you say, given a copy to the fire brigade. But I thought, there was value in him seeing what our strategy looked like, and he might have had something useful to contribute. We could always have reviewed and gone for a subsequent version. So I gave that to him, and, well, probably you'll lead me on to it, but he sent back something that was entirely different, and based on a structure that we didn't actually have. So in all of the documentation, there is a fire safety policy which is allegedly written by Michael and myself that we never adopted because it didn't reflect working practice.
I think you've encapsulated in summary what I am going to come on to.
Sorry.
No, it's all right. Just at this stage, though, just on what was happening at this time.
Yes.
You had drafted the November 2013 fire safety strategy. You'd given that to the LFB in December. They'd effectively approved it.
Yeah.
But at this meeting, Mr. Lyons is brought on board, and he's going to have another look at it.
Well, he's their health and safety manager. I wasn't sure whether he'd have any comments to make, but it was important that he saw it because obviously he's responsible for the responsive repairs. So if there are things in there that he feels need to reflect their working practices differently or their timeframes or whatever, now was the time to find out, really.
What was his role in the fire safety strategy?
Well, Repairs Direct were always kind of entirely separate, but obviously when there are actions that are of a responsive nature, then they need to be allocated to them. So from my perspective, I saw him as expediting anything that needed to be done, making sure it was done to the right standard, that it was done to fire resisting, etc.
Did you discuss any substantive changes with Michael Lyons?
No. And I was rather surprised that when he responded to my email, it was with an entirely different document, not the one I sent him.
Okay. Well, let's just take this in stages then. You say that the LFB were provided with a copy of the draft fire safety strategy. Did they ever get a further version beyond the one that Mr. Cumry got in December?
No, they
Right.
didn't.
Now, moving on in time, we know that the next operational Health and Safety Committee meeting was on the 21st of March 2014. Let's look at the minute to that, but I'm asking you a series of negatives. TMO 00844-024. There's the minute of it.
Okay.
There it is, 21st of March 2014. You are present, as is Michael Lyons. Now, one can scroll down through this document, but take it from me that there is no reference in this minute to the fire safety strategy or policy. Do you know why that was?
Possibly. When I received Michael's email appending an entirely different document, I looked through it and it set up a structure for managing fire safety, which wasn't the one that we currently had. And it seemed to reflect that the oversight of the fire risk assessment process would be a contract manager role, newly created, reporting to Alex Bosman. And so I sent, which was news to me, I hadn't been made aware that there were going to be substantive changes. So I sent the copy of the policy through to Anthony Parks, my line manager, and said, actually, Michael's given me this. Does this reflect a change that's going to happen? And he came back and said, no, that wasn't the case. That I imagine that those discussions must have been had, and ultimately they must have decided not to progress that. But I wasn't party to any of those conversations, so I can't really tell you anything more than that.
No, I'm just trying to work out what happened to the November 2013 fire safety strategy. It was signed off by the Operations Committee and the LFB, but then was left open. Does this tell us that because of the arrival, if you like, of Michael Lyons, the November 2013 fire safety strategy was never actually formally approved and adopted by either the Operational Health and Safety Committee or the Health and Safety Committee?
No, it was.
It was?
It was adopted. It was merely, from my perspective, it was finalised. I wouldn't have given it to the fire brigade if I didn't feel it was. It was just as a courtesy because Michael was new and he was integral in getting some of the actions progressed. It felt like he at least ought to be aware of what we were saying, but also if he felt strongly that something needed to be edited, I wanted him to have the opportunity to do that.
I follow. That's very clear. Now then, I think we can take the rest of this a little bit more quickly. Can we go, please, to TMO 1004, TMO 1004 0770. This is a 2014 fire safety policy. Author, job title, Health and Safety Manager. Date of issue, January 2014. Review date, January 2015. At the very bottom of your screen, you can see author Michael Lyons.
Yes.
Is this a document that arrived in your inbox from him?
I believe it is,
Which you were not expecting?
No.
Right. Now, there are various iterations of this document, but the most recent one we have is, I'll show it to you, TMO 008 56458. And it's got an issue date of May 2014, as you can see there, with joint authorship at the bottom, you and Michael Lyons.
Yep.
Do you recognise that document?
No.
Can you explain how your name appears as author?
I can't. If I'm sure this is the same document, which clearly shows the fire safety function sitting within the contracts management team, in which case I would never have authored that document because that did not reflect our structure.
You sound as if you're familiar with this. Is that because you've reviewed this document closely before giving evidence, so you can say that?
I think I've scanned it. I'm confident that I've scanned it.
No, fair enough. All right.
Yeah.
So can we take it then that this document, as it were, came from nowhere and went nowhere?
Pretty much.
Right. Then let's move on then into May 2014 proper. TMO 1000 6358, and I'm going to ask you about Matt Hodgson. What I'm showing you is a minute from the Operational Health and Safety Committee meeting on the 16th of May 2014, and you are present. Mm-hmm. You can see that Peter Madison and Sasha Jevons are also present, and if you go to page 3, under the item Progress with Review, it's actually part of 3, I think, although the 3's gone a bit awry. Progress with review / adoption of Matt Hodgson's H&S policies. Do you see that? Mm-hmm. And it says, SJ, Sasha Jevons, raised concerns over the lack of formality of signing off new processes. PM suggested that JW should take the comments / feedback from this group to Anthony Parks before presenting it to the board. The group discussed how best to finalise / implement Matt's policies, and it was agreed that this should be tied into the session with ET on 3rd June, as well as including it within the report to the board meeting in July.
Yes.
Now, Matt's policies, is that a reference to Matt Hodgson?
It is, yes.
And his role was what? To include providing health and safety services to the TMO, yes?
He was engaged by Anthony and Robert, I believe, to have a look at health and safety across the organisation. This was in an action in the follow-up to the audit report, which got limited assurance. So he was appointed to do that. He interviewed quite a few of us, and he eventually produced a report which he presented to exec team, which made quite a lot of recommendations. I think you might have showed me some of it earlier, the one where he said I was the competent person.
Yes.
That one. And so there were a range of things that he recommended, and some of them were fairly specific policies around Legionella and such like. And he went on, I presume he was then commissioned to go on and draft some of these policies.
Do you know why?
Sorry,
I'm so sorry.
No, I was just going to say, at this stage, I think there was some frustration about there not being any formal sign-off for the policies that he was drafting.
Right. And was his role to include fire safety policy?
No, I don't think he really had a remit specifically in regards to fire safety policy.
Right. Why was Sasha Jevons concerned about the lack of formality about signing off new processes? Do you remember?
Anthony, to the best of my recollection, Anthony engaged Matt, and I had never seen his brief, so I wasn't really clear what he'd been asked to do. But that was absolutely fine. But then I think the brief also changed, and I think Sasha's frustration was that she was perhaps not party to those conversations. I assumed they were had with all of the executive team, but perhaps not.
Right.
So there were things happening that she was unhappy with, or she felt related to her areas, and she perhaps didn't have control over, oversight of. I'm speculating, but that's my sort of memory of.
No, that's okay. Now tell me, do you know, in simple terms, what was the reason why Matt Hodgson was retained in the first place?
I think it was in relation to the limited assurance audit. There was a view, well, let's have a more rigorous look at all of our compliancy, all of our health and safety issues, and see if there are any issues that we need to tease out, rather than just look at the RBKC audit, which was fairly short, fairly brief.
Now, there's no reference here to the 2014 fire safety policy, or indeed in any of the Health and Safety Committee meeting minutes in 2014. Is that because, as you agreed with me earlier, the Michael Lyons draft went in one ear and out the other?
Pretty much.
Right.
Yeah. It wasn't adopted because it didn't reflect our practice.
Now, moving then on to 2015, can I just show you something from Alpesh Patel? This is RBK 30588245. This is Alpesh Patel's second witness statement to the inquiry, and he's explaining the March 2016 RBKC audit of TMO's health and safety system. That's his statement on the screen.
Yes.
Do you remember him being involved in the 2016 audit?
Yeah, he was involved in several audits, and so he obviously in doing that work, he would spend some time with my colleague Adrian and with myself.
Right. Now, if you go to page 12, please, in that statement, paragraph 32, you'll see that he says this at the end of the third line. He says, the testing schedule shows that Janice Wray provided me with examples of the latest internal policies and procedures, which had recently been refreshed and updated, examples of which included the water management policy and water management procedures, asbestos policy, gas access and gas safety policy, and fire safety policy and strategy, AP238. Now, he exhibits AP38, and that is at RBK 3058236. Let's just tease that out. Okay. It's a document, as you'll see, entitled Fire Safety Policy and Strategy, which is how he correctly refers to it. And it's in a format we saw earlier, the Michael Lyons format, and it's dated May 2014 with a review date of 2015, and you are the author at the bottom. Do you recognise this document?
Not at first glance. Could I look inside?
Absolutely. Let's go to page 1. Or rather, let's go to page 2. There's 3.
Okay. It looks at a glance like me reformatting what we already had in our strategy document.
Being the November 13.
Yes. It may well go, looks like it goes beyond that, and obviously it mentions the LGA guide. So it looks like a slightly updated, but
right.
Sort of...
Now, we've seen no record that this document was ever presented to the Operational Health and Safety Committee for approval. Is that correct?
Yes, probably is.
So do you know whether it was ever approved and adopted formally?
I don't.
Given that we have no record that the Health and Safety Committee approved this document, do you know under whose authority it was issued, if it was ever issued? It says date of issue, May 2014. Do you know whether it was actually issued?
I don't believe it was.
Right.
I wonder if it was in a draft version that I gave to Alpesh. I can't.
Why would you have given it to Alpesh Patel if, in fact, it was never approved?
Well, if I'd explained that it was a draft version that we were looking to work to, I don't know. I mean, that's all I can suggest.
Right. On our review, the content is closely similar to, or similar at least, to the November 2013 fire safety strategy you drafted and which was approved.
Yeah.
Was this intended to be a revised version of that document?
I think that the feedback I had from Anthony Parks to the document that Michael Lyons produced sort of said, oh, I like this aspect of it and I like that aspect of it. And I maybe took on board some of what he said and tried to redraft. But this didn't get adopted. We're still on 2013. Apologies.
Right. Okay. Then let's move into 2016 proper. Can we go to your first witness statement, please, at paragraph 190, TMO 500890, page 42, paragraph 190. And you say there, in November 2016, it was agreed between the TMO Health and Safety Committee and the RBKC that the TMO fire safety strategy would be revised. Now, would you agree, just pausing there, that the process for reviewing the fire safety strategy started in April 2016?
Yes.
And we know that because there's a Health and Safety Committee meeting on the 12th of April 2016 where that's referred to.
Yes, that's right. I think RBKC got involved by November because that's when we were talking to them about budgets for self-closers and...
Right. Well, let me just put that up on the screen so that everybody can see what you and I are talking about. It's TMO 100-12811, page 4. Let's have page 1 to start with, to show you the date and the attendees of the meeting. Can we just... That's it. We can see you're there, 12th of April, 2016. Page 4, please. Bottom of page 4, item 6. Review, fire safety policy and strategy. Janice advised that it was timely to review our fire strategy to ensure it continues to be compliant with legislation and best practice, and that we are able to effectively control the fire risks that we face. And the result of that was, as you say in your statement, that there should be a revision. Let's go then to TMO 100-24351. This is the document that you presented, I think, to that meeting. Just confirm that, first of all. It's a document entitled Review of Fire Safety Strategy Paper, Paper 4. So is that a document?
It looks like it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, page 2 has your name at the bottom. We'll just go to that.
April, yeah.
At the date of April 2016. And if we look at the second, if you go back to page 1 and look at the second paragraph of that, you say that the Health and Safety Committee is encouraged to provide their views on our current strategy and any changes that they feel are required. To assist with this process, a copy of the current strategy is attached and some initial points for consideration are summarised below. And if you look at page 3, the current strategy is there. That's the November 2013 version of the fire safety strategy.
Yes.
But with a note which says for review April 2016. And again, just to be absolutely clear, page 20 is where we see your name and date, November 2013.
Okay.
So it looks as if, it's certainly by April 2016, the November 2013 fire safety strategy was still in force, yes?
Yes.
And hadn't been superseded by the 2014 Michael Lyons document or the 2015 document that you gave to Alpesh Patel in the spring of 2016.
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Right, that's very clear. Now, if we go, please, to page 1 of this document, we can see that you say, this is the first paragraph, it is timely to review this strategy to ensure that our policies continue to comply with legislation and London Fire Brigade advice, stroke guidance and requirements. Just pausing there. And then you set out, after the second paragraph, a long list of bullet points for review. Second one is management arrangements for fire safety. The third is LFB home fire safety visits. The fourth is fire extinguishers, hose reels, dry and wet risers. The fifth is about FRAs. And if you look at the third bullet point, or sub-bullet point there, it deals with material alterations. You see that? Mm-hmm. Significant changes to block or type of resident or major fire. Yeah. And then the sixth bullet point, stay put evacuation strategy, better publicity query. Now, that was in paper 4. That's what you produced for the Health and Safety Committee. Do you know whether this paper was presented to any other TMO committee or the executive team or senior management team, SMT?
It would be my assumption that because this committee feeds directly into the executive committee and Barbara's role as executive team health and safety person, I would assume that she discussed this with them. Also, as you know, Sasha's also on this group, so we've already got 2 members of executive team who are kind of engaged in this process. I can't tell you what goes to senior management team because I was never a member and I didn't see their agendas, or I don't even know how frequently they met, so I wouldn't be in a position to advise on that.
Right. Now, do you know, can you remember what triggered this list or this suggestion that there should be a new review and that it should include these points?
We need to review things regularly. The most obvious reason for it being now is the Adair Tower fire, which had obviously just happened. But there's a lot of things here that we've been thinking and pondering about how we could do differently or how we could do better. So this is just me kind of doing a brain dump of things that I think should be considered, but obviously it's not necessarily comprehensive. It's just a starter for 10, really.
Now, if we go back to where we were in your statement, paragraph 190 at page 42, please, you say the main changes we intended to implement were a more proactive approach to the installation of self-closing devices to flat doors.
Yep.
See that?
Yes.
Across the stock, an increase in the frequency of FRAs and a requirement for fire action notices in the communal entrance lobbies of all blocks. And then you go on to say, I provide the history. Now, in the beginning of that paragraph, you refer to an agreement with RBKC to cover those topics. Who was it at RBKC who was involved in the decision to make those changes? Do you know?
My understanding is that Barbara, was it called Joint Management Team? I think Barbara discussed with Laura and Laura's colleagues. I don't know at what stage the engagement started, but the decision about self-closers and inspection programmes was discussed with, I believe, Laura, possibly also Amanda, I'm not clear.
And we then come to 2017, and I just want to ask you about the version of the fire safety strategy in play in that year, the year of the fire. Yeah. TMO 1-001-7036. This is the TMO fire safety strategy dated June 2017.
Yes.
And if we go to page 17, we can see it bears your name and date. I'll come back to well, I may not need to, but in your statement, can we just look at your first statement, please, at page 41? Paragraph 186, you say, at the time of the fire, the TMO had in place a fire safety strategy, which was an overarching strategy document outlining how fire safety was to be approached by the organisation. Now, you refer to the document I've just shown you. I produced the first draft, which was reviewed by the Health and Safety Committee before it went to the executive team. I'm aware that there are many draft versions of this strategy, as it was often reviewed and discussed. However, a version was always in force at any given time. And then if we go to paragraph 191 of your statement, page 42, it says, at the time of the fire, in June 2017, the updated TMO fire safety strategy was in its final draft stage, and I recall that we had a final review meeting the day before the fire. The updated strategy took longer to implement than expected due to lengthy discussions that took place between Barbara Matthews and the RBKC in respect of the process and programme for retrofitting self-closing devices to every flat entrance door in the stock. I was not involved in these discussions. However, my understanding is that the TMO recommended completing the retrofitting programme within 3 years, whereas the RBKC required the programme to be completed over 5 years. Now, is it right, therefore, that the 2017 fire safety strategy was still under review at the time of the Grenfell Tower fire?
It was agreed on the 13th. It was agreed at the meeting the day before.
Right, it was agreed, I see.
Yeah.
So it was in place at the time of the fire in that sense?
Yeah.
Right. Now, given that the process of revision had started in April 2017, do you know why the updated version of the fire safety strategy only reached the TMO Health and Safety Committee in June of that year?
I think, without going back in the minutes, and in the minutes will be clear, I think it had been to the committee on at least 1 or 2 occasions before, but there was quite a lot that we were tweaking and we were looking to review. And there were things like, in terms of the self-closer programme, we were asked to obtain prices. And there were various things that were outside of my control that I needed to get responses to. Just unfortunately, these things take longer than you would ever wish them to.
Yes. Now, I want to go back to the FRA programme and what happened with that. Now, it's right, isn't it, that the high-risk programme of FRAs had been undertaken by Salvage?
Yes.
And that programme came to an end in March 2010?
Yes.
If we go to your first witness statement at page 30, please, paragraph 135, we can see what you say there. You say, at the commencement of the high-risk FRA programme, one of the commitments we gave to the LFB was that we would evaluate the performance of our fire risk consultant. This was jointly undertaken by the TMO and RBKC at the conclusion of the programme in February 2010, and it was decided that we would undertake a procurement exercise to appoint the fire risk assessor for the medium and low risk phases of the programme. Now, why was that commitment given to the LFB? Do you know?
Well, I think they wanted to be assured that even though we were doing all sorts of checks and including them in vetting pro formas and attending progress meetings, that if we had any concerns or issues, that we would address them. We wouldn't let problems continue. I'm not suggesting there were any, but I think it seemed reasonable to be reviewing progress.
And was the evaluation of Salvage carried out?
Yes, I believe it was.
And what was the upshot?
I think we agreed with RBKC that we would reprocure. We were quite happy for Salvage to be one of the people on the list. But I think we felt that we'd learned quite a lot from the programme, and we were kind of a bit more informed about doing the procurement on this occasion. So that was the decision.
Right. Do you know who carried out that evaluation?
It would probably have been the people who were involved in the procurement initially. So it may have been Valerie Sharples. I would imagine it was Anne Muchmore. I think it was the people who were involved in the original procurement of Salvage.
Right. And what did they use as their benchmarks or objective criteria against which to evaluate Salvage's performance?
Well, we looked at what we'd originally asked them to achieve, and had they met their programmes, were we happy with the quality of their documentation, was the fire brigade happy with the quality of their documentation, where we had specific areas where we were seeking their advice, did we find that helpful, were they responsive, all the things you would expect, really.
Right. Why was it decided that the TMO and RBKC would re-tender for the medium risk and low risk programmes when you weren't unhappy with Salvage? We weren't unhappy with Salvage. We just felt that we understood more clearly what we needed. Right. As I say, they were always going to be on the tender list, so we weren't not giving them an opportunity to compete. You say you weren't unhappy with Salvage?
There were things that I was frustrated with, but I wasn't unhappy with them. The quality of their work was good.
Let's go to RBK 305588, please, and go in that email run to page 3. This is an email from you to Anne Muchmore of the RBKC on the 11th of February 2010, copied to Lornette Pemberton and others, including Robert Black, and further to our brief discussion following the last progress meeting with Salvage, as the high-risk programme is on schedule to complete as agreed by late March/early April, it is now timely to consider how the medium-risk and low-risk programmes will be funded, resourced and progressed. I anticipate that we have a few options. And then under the third paragraph, you say this, look to find an alternative method. I can confirm, you say, that Salvage are currently on schedule to complete the high-risk programme within the agreed 6-month time span. Additionally, it is fair to say that the programme has progressed relatively smoothly, and generally with the approval of the LFB. However, I have some concerns that Salvage are very rule-bound, and despite what they say about being prepared to challenge the LFB and acting on our behalf, as we are their client, I believe that they have shown some reluctance to challenge the LFB on thorny issues. For example, I haven't found them to be hugely helpful or proactive on our behalf on the issue of whether or not we need to do as the LFB insist and install dry risers at Gilray House, etc. And then you go on to say, at the very end of that paragraph, therefore, personally, I'd be keen to tender the medium risk programme in the same way as we did with the high rise. Now, when you say that Salvage was very rule-bound and reluctant to challenge the LFB on thorny issues, what did you mean?
The example that I'm quoting there is, it relates to 4 identical blocks, which were, I think, about 7-storey, just a shade over 18 metres tall. So you would therefore expect them to be built with a dry rising firefighting main. For reasons none of us understood, they weren't. And the fire brigade were saying that we needed to retrospectively fit dry rising mains on each of the 4 buildings. And then this goes back to what I did say this morning. The building controls view was that retrospective fitting wasn't required. I needed to be absolutely clear that there wasn't another option for how we could mitigate any potential risks before I went back and said to people, I need this amount of budget to do this amount of work. And it was quite frustrating that I couldn't get anyone to give me a straight answer. And Salve was kind of slightly sat on the fence on it. I didn't feel that when I needed them to give me a clear steer, I didn't feel that they did. And, you know, their work was really good. All the stuff that I've said here is absolutely true. But when we really needed to be clear about how we jumped in a difficult situation, that was going to impact on budgets, because fine, we could have found the budget, but it would have meant that something else didn't happen. So I needed to be absolutely sure that when I went back to say, we need to do this, that this is what it costs and this is how long it will take, and we need to do it because it's an absolute requirement, that I was right. But I didn't have the confidence to do that because there was a lot of toing and froing and nobody giving me a definitive steer. So that's the kind of issue I had when we appointed Salvage in the beginning. I said these are a few issues like this that come up that we've been unable to really bottom out.
Right.
And they were aware that, and to be fair, they had consistently tried to get a meeting with, I think it was Steve Turek, because Andy Furness sat on, I think, an IOSH committee with fire safety. A fire safety remit, and so he met with quite a lot of kind of high-ranking LFB people. So I think he thought that was the way that we would get the definitive answer that we needed about standards. And in the end, after much toing and froing, we were told that he declined all meetings with us. So on the one hand, I've got the fire risk assessor telling me that we need to do something, but not being able to really back it up. So I'm not confidently in a position to go back and tell people that we need to find budget to do this. And I'm sort of left where I was at the start of the programme. So that's sorry, you're probably getting all of my frustrations.
Yes. Well, and what was it that you wanted from a new independent fire risk assessor that Salvage weren't giving you?
I just wanted them to be able to give me a clear view of what I needed to do and what I didn't. And if there was another way of mitigating risk, could they tell me what that was? But I wasn't getting another way of mitigating risk. I was sort of just getting a problem that I couldn't find a solution for.
Yes. I mean, it doesn't really say that, does it? What it says is you have some concerns that Salvage are very rule-bound. What was the problem with that?
Well, I can only really reiterate that they weren't giving me an answer to the problem that I had, and they were kind of.
Is it?
Pardon?
That's not quite the same thing, is it? What did you mean by Salvage are very rule-bound?
I probably meant that they're inclined to say, well, if the fire brigade are asking for it, you probably need to do it, but not that you definitely need to do it.
Right. And you say, despite what they say about being prepared to challenge the LFB, you say, I believe they've shown some reluctance to challenge the LFB. You're not really saying that they're giving you muddy advice or they're being equivocal. What you're saying is they're taking the LFB's side as opposed to taking your side. That's how I read that. Is that an unfair reading, Ms. Wray?
That might be what it says, but that wasn't what I meant it to say, having lived it. My view was I just needed to be absolutely sure. For example, in the case of the flat entrance doors, once we knew we needed to do it, we found the budget to do it, and we did do it. It was just that this And this issue didn't just relate to these 4 blocks. We had, I think, a couple of other blocks. So it's quite a big commitment. So I need to be absolutely clear that we can't mitigate the risk in other ways. And they weren't giving me that. They weren't. So they're my kind of fire safety specialist advice. And I'm still caught between the fire brigade and building control without a clear steer.
You see, the LFB was the enforcing authority under the RRO, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
So why not just do as they asked or required, rather than setting out to test what they're saying or challenge, actually, it's the word you use. Why are you wanting to challenge the enforcing authority?
I'm wanting to do what the enforcing authority need me to do. But what I'm saying is that in some circumstances, that isn't the only way to mitigate the risk. So I'm trying to be clear that if there's an alternative, which may be less invasive for residents, may be just as effective, hopefully is just as effective, could we find out what that is? Because the impact of everything that we agree to do means that somebody else won't get heating or hot water, or that's just the world that we lived in. So you needed to be absolutely sure that what you've been asked to do is what you need to do in that way. And if I'd been assured of that, I'd have gone back and fought with everybody to get that to happen. But I wasn't yet in a position to confirm that that's what we absolutely had to do.
So I wonder whether this evidence you're giving is just a bit of a gloss now on the historical words that you used, which I've shown you. And if you really did want to take an approach which was cooperative with the LFB to see if there was a more cost-effective and practical way of going about satisfying their requirements, you might have said so. But instead, you want to go into a tender because Salvage are reluctant to challenge the LFB on thorny issues. That's a different approach, isn't it? It's more hostile. Do you accept that?
Well, it wasn't meant to be. I'm generally not a hostile person, so that wasn't my intention. Probably my frustration is coming out here because this is exactly the kind of issue that led to the threat of enforcement action because we got into this, does this need to happen? Building control saying, no, it doesn't, fire brigade, and me caught going, well, what is it you want me to do? It's really important. Do we need to know what is the standard here? And in the meantime, they've got the fire brigade then saying, well, no, at high level, we're refusing to meet with you. And actually, to be fair, I think Salvage had their own frustrations because they had started off the programme with us saying we need to be sure that we're meeting the fire brigade's requirements in terms of the standard setting. So they wanted this meeting as much as I did, not just in relation to this issue, but other issues that they felt weren't being addressed.
Now, can we then move further into 2010? TMO 100 37421, page 8. This is part of your report to the Operations Committee in May 2010, and at page 8, under paragraph 12.2, you ask them to note our proposed approach to progressing the medium risk blocks. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Did you have to get approval or sign-off from the Operations Committee in order to progress the tender?
Can't remember, actually. I would have... procurement's not something I know much about, so I would have always gone to procurement colleagues to ask them what I needed to do.
Right.
I think that the borough also funded the medium risk programme, so I would have had to get their sign-off as well.
Okay. You could see under at the top of that page, under legal issues, in the last sentence of paragraph 9.1, the responsible persons of the TMO and RBKC. You can see there. Do you know what made you say that in this document?
I think there was a standard... Sorry to speak over you. I think there was a standard format that we had to follow. We had to have legal issues. We had to have communication, resident engagement. I think there was a template that we were required to use for committees' reports, and so that was just my standard.
And then we can see the meeting. TMO 1003747, page 88. This is TMO 1003747. Yes, thank you. This is the minute of the meeting of the 25th of May 2010.
Okay.
Operations Committee. You see that?
Yeah.
And you're in attendance after the and. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yes. And if we go to page 89, agenda item 5 was fire risk assessments. You can see that there. and the committee received a report on progress. There's no minuted discussion in this document about the fire risk assessor himself. Do you remember whether any questions were asked about the fire risk assessor and competence?
Sorry, I wouldn't remember.
Right. Once the high-risk programme had ended, did you consider whether there'd be a need for regular fire risk assessments of the high-risk properties?
I think we should have. I think at that stage we were gearing up to get the medium risk on the ground as soon as possible, because as you know, we had our 3-year deadline of getting through the whole process. So I'm not sure it was on our radar at that point in time.
Right.
But came quite quickly.
Right. Do you remember discussing with RBKC the subject of putting a programme and funding in place for having regular FRAs for your high-risk properties in your portfolio?
Not specifically, but we had made a commitment, and we would find the money somehow or other.
Right. Now, at this stage, May 2010, who did you envisage would carry out the continuing FRAs for the high-risk blocks in the TMO stock?
I was probably quite short-sighted and didn't give it as much consideration as I should have done.
So is the answer that you didn't envisage anybody at that stage?
It was just off my radar. We'd only just completed them, and the oldest one was 6 months old, right. And there were no material alterations happening on any of the blocks. So I thought I had a little bit of time, and at the moment, medium and moving on to low will get the whole stock assessed. So that was probably my priority.
Well, let's then talk about medium and the appointment of Carl Stokes. Can we look at your second statement, please? TMO 00842-341, page 3, paragraph 11. You set out there the documents that you sent to Carl Stokes on the 6th of August 2010, inviting him to tender for the medium risk FRA programme. You see that?
Yes.
And one of the documents you exhibit there is the consultant's brief of July 2010. Can I take you to that? It's at TMO 0084-2371. Did you draft that document?
No, I doubt it. It was probably drafted by my colleague in the procurement, the professional services officer. I don't think it would be me.
Right, who was that, please?
Janet Rhymes, the lady's name was?
Janet Rhymes.
Yes.
Yes, I see. You referred to her earlier on. Did you have any input into the contents of this document?
I'm sure that I did, but...
I mean, do take time to have a look at it. If we just scroll down to page 3, for example, which is the general information and requirements, it might refresh your memory.
I'm sure that I did, but I...
You can't recall which parts?
No, sorry.
So Janet Rhymes, possibly you. Anybody else, do you think?
I'm sure we would have shared it with RBKC colleagues. They may or may not have had something they wanted to add. I'm not sure if Valerie was also still involved as the project manager.
You don't know.
I'm speculating, sorry.
Whilst we're on page 3, can we look at paragraph 1.5? It says there, it is a requirement of the client that the consultant holds a current fire risk assessment qualification, e.g. from IOSH, NEBOSH, the Northern Ireland Fire Safety Panel, or similar, to be submitted for approval by the TMO before the consultant's tender is accepted. See Part 4, quotation instructions. Just pausing there, can we go to page 25, which sets out the information that the consultant tendering for the project was required to supply. You can see there quotation submissions. And in the list, at the very foot of the page, 7.1D is additional information. And under little Roman 3, it says details of professional qualifications, in particular fire risk assessment qualifications and experience of the project leader and proposed team members who will carry out the assessments. Do you remember whether that was something in respect of which you had input?
I don't. The preceding thing that you just showed me, setting out the possible qualifications, I think came from RBKC. I think this was left from the initial procurement, and I believe that Alexis Correa put that bit in himself when we did the original tendering of the high risk.
I see, thank you. Do you remember what Carl Stokes gave you to support, by way of evidence, his fire risk assessment qualifications and experience?
I don't as we sit here now, but
Right.
probably quite a lot.
Well, we understand that Mr. Stokes gave you a loose set of documents together with his public liability insurance and certificates. I can show you that. It's a TMO 008800581. That's his insurance certificate. But do you remember whether he provided you with any information about his experience as a fire risk assessor?
I can't recall. I understood what his work experience was. I knew that he'd been in the Fire and Rescue Service as fire safety officer. And by then, obviously, we knew that he'd undertaken quite a few of the fire risk assessments on our high-risk blocks.
Yeah.
So we'd had first-hand experience. His work, obviously, was quality checked by Salvage because that's how they operated. But we'd been sharing the FRAs with the fire brigade, and I recall at the end of the high-risk programme, we had a hard copy of all 110, and the brigade asked for that, so I dropped it off at the fire station. So we had sort of quite a lot of belief that he had good experience directly on our blocks.
Did you ever receive a CV from Carl Stokes?
Can't remember.
Do you remember if it was received as part of the tender submission?
It's possible. I'm sorry, I can't remember.
Right. Did it ever come from Salvage? Did Salvage ever provide you with a CV for Carl Stokes when he was part of the high-risk programme?
I do recall asking for the details of all of their assessors, but I can't recall what documentation I did get. And in fact, a couple of them never worked on the project, so some of the names didn't materialise. Sorry.
Can we go to TMO 00842-327? This is the tender evaluation report that you produced on the 27th of September 2010 at the very end of the tender process, which you refer to in paragraph 12 of your second witness statement. There's no need to go to that. Do you remember who was part of this, the panel who conducted this tender evaluation report?
I'm assuming that it was Anne Muchmore and Janet Rhymes or Valerie Sharples.
I see. So a combination of RBKC and the TMO.
Yes.
If you look at paragraph 1.2, it says there in the second line, additionally, all consultants attended a formal interview with a panel consisting of 2 TMO and 1 RBKC officer, so that further checks on the quality of the consultants could be undertaken and any queries on their submission could be clarified. Do you remember who it was as part of that panel, particularly? Was it the individuals you just referred to, Anne Muchmore, Janet Rhymes, and Valerie Sharples?
I believe so, yes.
Right. And do you know what checks on the quality of the consultants were undertaken?
No, as we sit here now, I'm sorry.
Do you recall how that panel went about assessing the requisite experience and qualifications for those tendering for that programme?
No.
In your first witness statement, page 31, paragraph 137, we'll just have a look at that. You say, in the middle, it was agreed that Carl had the right knowledge, competence, experience and enthusiasm to be a good partner for the TMO. That's what you say there. Mm-hmm. And if we go back to the tender evaluation report, which we've just been looking at, page 2, if we go to page 2, under paragraph 2.4, at the top of the page, you say, the same consultant, C.S. Stokes, was rated first for quality, but also submitted the lowest price for the 6-month programme. Do you remember how you and the panel were assured of Carl Stokes' qualifications, competence and experience for the purposes of carrying out the medium-risk FRA programme?
Well, we must have had a CV. We must have had details of his work experience. We knew what he'd been doing for Salvage on our high-risk properties. we would have known what CPD he'd been doing, and we must have used that to make a judgment. We had set questions, as you would expect, and we scored them according to a sort of an agreed approach, but we did it individually, and then we compared notes, as you would expect again.
Well, you referred to his CV a minute ago. Let's look at it. It's CST 401895. Now, just to be clear, is this the document that you received from Carl Stokes as part of his tender?
It could have been.
Right.
I mean, I don't know whether he's changed it since.
I see what you mean. Looking at his qualifications there, under the heading qualifications, was there any particular qualification that told you that Carl Stokes had the relevant knowledge and competence?
So I think he's got the European Diploma in Fire Safety, which I would have been aware of. I think he had a range of experience. He clearly had done quite a lot of continuing professional development. I would have questioned him on the NEBOSH because it's a little bit vague, and I know that you're looking at diplomas and certificates really to use NEBOSH unless you've just done a managing safely qualification. But it seemed to be a balance of technical issues, fire safety, and kind of, I think obviously we then talked to him about fire risk assessment specifically. So that plus the fact that he had 8 years as a fire safety officer, I think we thought was good.
Right. Is there any particular qualification that stands out in that list that you thought particularly marked him out as having first-rate quality?
I think I would have asked him about the National Occupational Standards. There's some that I wouldn't know a lot about, so I would have asked him questions, and then I would have gone away and done my own research.
Okay. Now, do you remember that Carl Stokes also sent you a sample fire risk assessment as part of his tender?
Yeah.
Yes, TMO 00880584. Do you remember whether that was, whether you got this document before the interview or afterwards?
I have no idea, sorry.
Did you get it before you appointed him or afterwards?
I would have assumed that I got all of the documentations from all of the tenderers before.
Yes. Do you remember whether you and the panel looked at this document?
We would have done, yes.
Yeah. If we go to page 5, we can see what he says in a paragraph under the heading "Assessment completed by," and then there's a chunk of text, 6 lines in all, in bold. You see that?
Yes.
Starts Mr. C. Stokes, ACI, ARB, etc. Now, you will know, I think, that this statement was repeated almost identically across all of his fire risk assessments he ever did for the TMO, updating it only by number of years as an independent fire risk assessor. That's correct, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes. Do you recall whether you and the panel considered the list of qualifications he set out here in this document?
Don't think we did.
You don't think you did?
No.
So do we take it from that it didn't assist you in making the decision that Carl Stokes had the right qualifications, competence and experience to carry out the FRAs as part of the medium-term programme?
Sorry, I really can't recall whether we looked at both or whether we looked at just one.
Right.
Sorry.
Mr. Chairman, it may be a convenient moment to take the break now. In the light of that, I can perhaps shorten the next run of questions.
Yes, well, if that's convenient to you, I'm sure it'll be convenient to Ms. Wray as well. So, Ms. Wray, we're going to take the afternoon break now. We'll come back, please, at 3:30. And again, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence until they're out of the room. All right? Thank you very much. Thank you. 3:30. Right, would you ask Miss Wray to come back in, please? All right, Miss Wray, ready to carry on?
Yes.
Now, before you do, I'm going to take it upon myself to ask you perhaps just to slow down a little bit.
Sorry.
And I'm going to ask Mr. Millett perhaps to pause a little more between the witness's answer and the question.
Yes, Mr.
The
Chairman.
next question.
Next question. Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Right, when you're ready, thank you.
I am. Miss Wray,
Yes.
you said in an answer just before the break that after the interview you went away and did your own research. Can you remember what research you did on Mr. Stokes' qualifications?
Probably would have been more about researching the qualifications that he'd identified that I was perhaps not familiar with, to learn the extent of what that meant, so that I had a full picture of what his experience and his training was.
Now, Dr. Lane and Colin Todd both agree that some of the qualifications identified by Mr. Stokes in the list that was on the screen in front of us did not exist. Was that something you discovered from your independent researchers, do you think?
Not the ones I looked at, no.
Right. Would you be surprised, or are you surprised, when I tell you that some of the qualifications for which Mr. Stokes made claim did not exist?
I'd be surprised. I know he sort of portrayed them as if they were post-nominals, and I knew that they weren't post-nominals. I always treated them as if they were a CPD, that you couldn't necessarily use in that way.
Can we go to your first witness statement, please, at page 31, paragraph 139. And you say there, throughout the entirety of our working relationship, I never had any concerns regarding Carl Stokes' competence. I was aware that he elected not to be on many of the professional registers. However, when I raised this with him, he assured me that he did not feel he would gain anything from these memberships. When did you become aware that he had not elected to be on many of the professional registers?
I think that as years went by, there were a number of accreditations which started to come on stream, meaningful accreditations for fire risk assessors, whereas prior to that, I'm not sure that there was much store by some of the things that existed. And so as I became aware of those, I would have spoken to him about them, had he ever considered being IFE or whatever.
And what does he say?
As I said here, he was, I think he was a bit cynical and sometimes thought that actually what would he get back? You pay an amount, but actually what do you get back?
Right.
But by then we'd obviously been using him for some considerable time and we were generally happy with his work.
Now, you say here that you were aware that he elected not to be on many of the professional registers. That tends to suggest that you thought he was at least on some professional registers. Is that right?
No, that's probably an error on my part.
Right. Did you know that he was on no professional registers?
Yes, I must have done.
You knew that?
Yes.
Were you ever aware of a guidance document published by the Fire Risk Assessment Competency Council called A Guide to Choosing a Competent Fire Risk Assessor?
Yes.
Can I ask you to look at it, please? It's at HOM 30-25548. This is the first version of this document published on the 1st of February 2013. Mm-hmm. Were you aware that the guidance, which starts on page 3, if we look at that, said, in the second paragraph, no matter who carries out the fire risk assessment, the duty holder retains the responsibility for ensuring the adequacy of that assessment. Were you aware of that?
Yes.
Yes. Just continuing with the text. If employing a specialist to undertake your fire risk assessment, whilst you're not expected to be an expert in fire safety, you should make reasonable checks to ensure that they are competent to do the job properly. There are some simple steps and precautions you can take to help verify the competence and suitability of a prospective fire risk assessor. And then it goes on. The first is, be satisfied that the fire risk assessor providing this service is competent to do so. We recommend that you check those providing this service have independent registration with or certification from a professional or certification body, and that they meet the competency criteria established by the Fire Risk Assessment Competency Council, see list below. Now, when you were reading with it, well, did you look at this document at the time, do you think, early 2013?
Possibly.
Right. When you did, or if you possibly did, were you concerned that Carl Stokes might not hold independent registration with or certification from a professional or certification body?
I think it's too strong to say concerned. I was aware, I discussed it with him, but if I'm honest, I'm not sure I encouraged him. I would have preferred him to register, but I felt it was his personal choice.
Well, you say it was his personal choice. Here is a guidance recommendation for you to check that he is independently registered with or certified by a professional or certification body.
And if we'd been, sorry, I'm not sure if I'm cutting across you.
No. Well, having shown you that text, my question is really why you say it was his personal choice. It was your choice, wasn't it? Whether or not you had a fire risk assessor who met those qualifications.
If we'd been procuring a fire risk assessor from that point onwards, then completely take on board that's what we would have required. Because he was someone we had already engaged, who demonstrated his competence, I didn't interpret this as meaning that he therefore had to go and get it. I interpreted this as meaning when I'm acquiring a fire risk assessor, this is what I need to do going forward.
I see. So does it come to this, that had this document been in circulation in 2010, you would have looked a lot more closely at the fact that Mr. Stokes did not have registration with or certification from a professional or certification body, but given that he'd already been in harness, as it were, for 2.5 years by this time, you didn't.
Yeah, that's basically it. As I said, the accreditations improved as the years went by and were kind of much more reputable and reliable. I think some of the early fire risk assessment accreditations weren't really, didn't hold a lot of water.
Now, were you aware that while he was at Salvage, his work was peer-reviewed?
Yes.
Often quite a number of times. We have a version 8, I think, of one of his documents.
Okay.
From October 2010, when you took him on as your medium risk programme fire risk assessor, he had only been an independent fire risk assessor for a year, hadn't he?
Yes.
Yes. And at that time, he had been under the supervision of senior experienced people at Salvage. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. As a result of that, when he came to you as an independent sole practitioner, were you concerned that his work for the TMO would be unsupervised?
I wasn't. I think it's fair to say that the fact that he'd been recruited, whatever his capacity was, whether he's employed or subconsulted, being recruited by Salvage, he had been one of the principal people they had used on our contract. It was potentially high-risk residential accommodation, so very important. The first time that Salvage had been our client, so I think it gave me faith that he had been used by that company in that way and that they would have mutually both learned quite a lot from each other. And if Salvage were unhappy with him, they wouldn't have let him continue to carry out the assessments on our high-risk properties.
Yes, but do you understand that there's all the difference between letting him carry out assessments on your high-risk properties under supervision and peer review on the one hand, and him performing the same function for the TMO without anybody in a position to supervise him or peer review his work?
I do understand that. Salvage were very exacting, and I do think that if they had been unhappy with his performance, regardless of how many revisions, they would not have let him continue on the contract. So I did get faith in the fact that he had continued. I thought that was an important factor. He was now familiar with quite a lot of our buildings, and everything that he had done appeared to meet the requirements of the fire brigade as well.
Why did you take on Carl Stokes, a fire risk assessor who would have no peer review and no supervision by anybody senior to him, of all those who were applying for the post?
I think he seemed he seemed to have good experience. He seemed to be extremely knowledgeable. He understood the Fire and Rescue Service, their procedures, what they had to do, how they did their auditing, all of that knowledge that we didn't have that would be really helpful. He had already familiarity with the overwhelming majority of our high-rise blocks. We were moving down to medium risk, where there would be a lot less maintenance, a lot less AOVs and such like kit. So it felt like less of a risk, but also he did do the best interview. He did. We were all, the three of us, unanimously felt that he was the best candidate on the day.
Did you ask him the question, who will be peer reviewing your work?
No, I can't have done. No.
Was it not a consideration when you were making the selection that there would be nobody there to supervise or peer review his work?
At that time, the brigade was still very heavily involved in scrutinising what we were doing. So I didn't feel it was a risk because I felt that any potential issue would be flagged up very definitely and very loudly and quite quickly. And we continued to share his assessments with the brigade on a regular basis. And, in truth, I didn't always agree with some of the things that he said. And I told him when I didn't agree. So we had a fairly robust relationship. But no, at the time, we felt he was the right appointment.
You see, there's a difference, isn't there, between relying on the LFB to pick you up robustly on the one hand, and Mr. Stokes carrying out his responsibilities for you as FRA on the other.
Of course.
Yes. I mean, on the one hand, Mr. Stokes is ensuring that you, the TMO, and you particularly as the competent person within the TMO, comply with their statutory obligations under the RRO, whereas the LFB is the enforcing authority.
Indeed. I'm well aware of that. I was merely saying that was an additional factor that we thought was actually a positive thing, that the level of scrutiny was an advantage, that any deviation from the suitable and sufficiency was likely to be flagged up quite loudly and quite quickly.
Yes, but that's not a very reasonable and sensible approach, is it, to rely on the enforcing authority to pick you up where you go wrong in breach of the statute?
No, and the point I'm making is I wasn't relying on it. I was just saying that it was an additional thing that we knew was in place.
Now, it's right to think that Mr. Stokes signed an acceptance of a fee tender on the 21st of October 2010. That's the date we have in your second witness statement in paragraph 13. Yes?
Yeah. Sorry, I don't have all the dates.
No, I can show you that if you want to. But
no, that's fine.
That was for the medium risk programme, wasn't it?
Yes.
And so he started work for you on the medium risk programme at that time, yes?
Yes.
Yes. Now, once he was appointed, did you again give a commitment to the LFB that you would evaluate his performance, as you had given the LFB in relation to Salvage when they came on board to do the high-risk programme in September 2009?
Yes, I believe that we did.
We did.
Sorry, could I just intervene before we move away from the point? Did you ask Mr. Stokes about other fire risk, or other clients for whom he'd done fire risk assessments? We know he'd worked for Salvage as a subcontractor, or at least
Yes.
as an employee or a subcontractor. But did you ask him who else he'd worked for and on what sort of buildings?
I did, and my impression was always that he had a range of residential housing experience, which is what we were always looking for. I can't recall the detail of his clients, and I know that at some stage, although I don't know if it was that far back or subsequently, he had a range of insurers he worked for, so that was all over the place in all sorts of different kinds of properties.
Were the insurers clients, or were they people who were insuring his?
No, there were clients. He was having to go off all over the country to I recall him being in Shetland once when I needed him. That's why it sticks in my mind. But yeah, I mean, we definitely would have asked about his range of experience, because we had specialised housing, we had temporary accommodation, and we had low risk, and we wanted to be assured that he had the full range, and I certainly had the impression that he had.
Right, thank you very much. I'm sorry, Mr. Willett.
Did you ask for or take up a client reference from Mr. Stokes?
No, I don't believe I did.
On the question of evaluation, did you evaluate his performance after he had taken on the role of the fire risk assessor for the medium risk programme?
Yes. I'm sure I would have done. I mean, we had our progress meeting. We still had RBKC involved. Believe we still had periodic meetings with the LFB attending. And I was the one setting him the programme, and I was the one who received all of his fire risk assessments. So yes, would have been reviewed.
And against what criteria or objective yardsticks did you measure his performance as a fire risk assessor from that time?
Obviously, we were always looking at his programme to see whether he was doing what he said he was going to do in the required time frame. To be honest, I'm probably going to be really vague about it now. I was scrutinising for consistency. If there were differences in properties that I thought were similar, then I would challenge him or ask for explanations. I can't really give you any more detail at this stage, I'm sorry.
During the currency of the medium risk programme, at least in its early years, how many fire risk assessments did Mr. Stokes provide to you a week?
I don't know. I don't even know. So there were 110 in the high rise.
High risk.
High risk. Apologies. I don't know whether I think we had in total about 650 blocks, so that still left over 500. I don't know if they were split evenly, whether it was 200, 250. I'm not sure. I could probably find out if I waded back through, but I don't know. But often quite a volume, and then other periods less so, depending on the programme and his other activities and what fitted with what we needed.
Did you read each and every one?
I read every action plan, and I endeavoured to read every fire risk assessment. Depending on the volume I was receiving, depended on how much attention I was paying. And if I'm honest, if we had 4 identical blocks, I would read one rigorously, and then I would, depending on how many I was getting through, I would not pay the same level of detail to the others, but I would try to get through all of them.
Did you have a helper to read them?
No.
It was all you?
It was me.
Yes. Okay. Now, can we go to your second witness statement, please? TMO 00842-341, page 4, paragraph 15. You say there, following the completion of the low-risk programme, Carl Stokes Associates was retained by the TMO as its fire safety consultant on a rolling basis until June 2017. Now, the FRA programme for high-risk, medium-risk and low-risk blocks ended in May 2012, didn't it?
Yes, I believe so.
The actual programme, yes. Can we then go to the TMO 100311056? And look at page 1 of that document. This is your report to the Operations Committee dated the 2nd of May 2013. You could see in the grey box the purpose of the report,
yes,
which is to appraise the Operations Committee of the TMO's current position in relation to fire risk assessments. And there are a number of things under paragraph 1.2 that you're asking the Operations Committee to note. Mm-hmm. And I'll just identify those for you there. And in particular, the last one is the recommendations made by the coroners following inquest on the Lacknell House fire and the Southampton fire, and response from the communities and local government to date. Now, if you go to page 2, you can see under paragraph 3.2 on that page, under the heading Progress with FRA Programme, you say, all 3 assessment programmes were completed in May 2012, a few months in advance of the LFB's July timescale, and such comprehensive FRAs are now available for every block. Comprehensive, quotes, suitable and sufficient, unquotes, FRAs have now been completed for each block. And then you see underneath that, paragraph 4.0, approach to reviewing FRAs. And you say this, FRAs are living documents which cannot remain valid for an unlimited length of time. Therefore, to ensure ongoing compliance with the legislation, assessments need to be reviewed and or reassessed periodically. With regard to how frequently FRAs are reviewed, the TMO have adopted the criteria set out in the current best practice guidance on fire safety and residential accommodation, fire safety and purpose-built blocks of flats produced by the local government group, published July 2011. Specifically, FRA reviews will be undertaken in the following circumstances: regularly, following material alterations at block, and then when there is a significant change in the matters that were taken into account as the risk assessment was carried out, such as a widespread change in the type of residents occupying the block, when there is a reason to suspect that the original FRA is no longer valid, for example, after a fire that occurred within or spread to the common parts, and, in caps, following completion of significant works instigated to address shortcomings identified by the FRA. And then you go on to say, depending on their complexity, these FRA reviews are being carried by either the TMO Health and Safety Team or the fire consultant. FRAs are being progressed according to the criteria above, and the programme progresses on schedule. After the FRA programme was completed, it's right, isn't it, that and after 2013 you implemented a programme of FRA reviews?
Yeah.
Is that right?
I can't remember when we implemented them before then, but yeah, we were doing low-level reviews in-house, which was really just in between the adjacent comprehensive reviews. It was a sort of spot check in between where there would be no material alterations. It was a way of checking that the actions which had been identified were being progressed.
Yes.
And my colleague was doing that as part of his regular visits to blocks. If he identified that there were works going on at the block that we hadn't been made aware of, that changed the priority and that changed the nature of the FRA. Right. And then that would go up into the programme and be done.
Were these reviews that you refer to in paragraph 4.4 here being carried out before the 2nd of May 2013?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yes. And now you say that they are being conducted either by the TMO Health and Safety Team or the fire consultant, who was Carl Stokes.
Yes.
Did the TMO Health and Safety Team carry out any reviews, or was that all left to Carl Stokes in all cases?
No, actually, we mostly did the low-level reviews ourselves because we could readily access the ordering system to see where repairs had been ordered, and it was easier for us to chase up.
When you say we, who was
Well,
the
actually,
we?
Adrian, my colleague, was doing most.
Adrian Bowman, was
Yes.
it? I see. And in the case of those reviews, how did you decide which reviews were, as you call it, low level? What do you mean by low level? Do you mean low risk?
No, I think what I mean by a low-level review is you've got your comprehensive assessment. Usually, depending on the risk rating of the block, either 12 months or 18 months later, you would want to do a low-level review. So you would want to go visually assess the block, check that the items that have been identified have been completed. If they haven't, chase them up and give somebody a load of grief for why they've not been. Yeah, so that's what we mean by low-level. It's done in-house, really about checking that nothing has changed, which has changed the priority of when the next assessment will be undertaken, and that the things that have been identified are being progressed.
Right, I see. So the review, it was not a review of the quality of Mr. Stokes' work.
No.
It was a review of the progress in closing out FRA actions.
Yes.
I see. And you mentioned Adrian Bowman. What training did Adrian Bowman have in respect of fire safety matters?
He's got an IOSH certificate. He did a fair bit of CPD. It was the same thing. We would check what was the most appropriate fire safety training for him to be doing. I can't tell you off the top of my head, but he would have brushed up on quite a lot of his skills. He would have sometimes done some joint stuff with Carl if they wanted to have a discussion about specific aspects of fire safety, and sometimes it was a better practical. He also organised the fire safety training that the estate staff and fire marshals, etc., attended. So he was often in dialogue with that person about tweaking that course
Right.
and making it more appropriate.
Did Mr. Bowman have any familiarity with or training on the LGA guide or PAS 79, which is by now in force?
Yes, almost definitely the LGA guide. I can't recall whether he has PAS 79.
Now, we know that Carl Stokes carried out his first independent fire risk assessment on Grenfell Tower on the 29th of December 2010.
Yes.
We have that just for reference purposes at CST 403181. Had you begun this programme of reviews of FRAs after the conclusion of the high risk programme in May 2010, or did that all wait until May 13 or thereabouts?
Okay. So what I recall is we took on Carl to do the medium risk FRAs, and then I probably naively realised that the high risk FRAs had all stated that they should be reviewed within 12 months. And at that time, my colleague hadn't had sufficient appropriate training. So at that time, I am confident I would have checked with my line manager and possibly with RBKC to say, can we ask Carl to review the high risk FRAs which are now coming up for review?
I see. And you, to review, to check whether the action items had been carried out?
No, in this case, it wouldn't have been as low level a review because the assessor was doing it. He would
Right.
He would do it to a high standard.
And was it for Carl Stokes to carry out those reviews even though he had not done the original FRA because they were on the high risk programme?
In this case, it was for him to do. We subsequently introduced the situation that I've explained to you about my colleague, but in this case, we asked him to do them.
Right. So Carl Stokes carried out reviews in relation to high risk where he hadn't done the FRA.
At that point in time, yes.
Yes, I see. Was that ever explained to the operations committee?
I don't think the operations committee was in existence at that time. Oh, sorry, I mean the high-level one. Actually, I'm sorry, I can't recall.
Right. You didn't re-tender the high-risk FRA contract, did you?
No, we didn't. And I wouldn't have just instructed him to do high-risk FRAs when he'd been appointed for medium without taking advice from procurement colleagues and my line manager and possibly also RBKC. But I don't seem to be able to evidence that, which is a bit frustrating.
Well, it may be, but do your best with your recollection. Why didn't you re-tender the high-risk FRA contract?
It's just time, really. So we're gearing up for the medium risk. The medium risk starts, and then I kind of realised that actually, because the high risk started September the previous year, some of those now had a 12-month review period. So we needed to very quickly get on and do the high risk, and that just procurement is slow and arduous, and it seemed that if my procurement colleagues were happy for us to proceed by instructing Carl to do them, that's what we would do.
I see. So you said before that it wasn't on your radar. Was it as a result of it not being on your radar, you ran out of time and then found yourself in a pickle?
Pretty much, unfortunately, yeah.
And that explains, does it, why there was no recruitment or selection process for who was going to do high-risk reviews after the first programme?
It does, but again, I would reiterate, I wouldn't have made those decisions without getting procurement colleagues to be very clear.
Yes. Did you discuss the non-procurement of Carl Stokes, as it were, for the high-risk programme with anybody at the TMO?
Yes, sorry, when I said procurement colleagues internally in the TMO, Lornette Pemberton, my line manager.
Right, Lornette Pemberton then.
Yes.
And what about anybody at RBKC?
I'm sure, although I can't specifically remember, I'm sure I would have contacted Anne Muchmore because she was my link person at the time, and if necessary, I would have escalated it within the housing team if that was her advice.
And who would that have been to?
Then I think, I don't know if it was still Pam Sedgwick or Amanda or perhaps to Laura.
I think at this stage, at that stage, it was probably Pam Sedgwick.
Okay, well, whatever she advised, I would have.
Is it right that Carl Stokes simply took over responsibility for that contract? It renewed to him, essentially.
Well, that wasn't the intention. Ultimately, that's what it ended up becoming, but that wasn't the original intention.
Did you get approval for that approach from either the TMO Executive Board or RBKC?
I can't recall. I can reiterate, I discussed it with Lornette and colleagues in the TMO procurement team and colleagues at RBKC, and I will have done whatever they required me to do, but I don't remember whether that was requested. Do
you know how the funding for Carl Stokes' work on the high-risk properties was approved?
I don't.
Right. Now, it's right, I think, that you didn't enter a written contract with Carl Stokes for him to carry out high-risk FRAs, did you?
No.
Why is that?
Again, I can only say that if I'd been instructed to do it, I would have done it because we had a history of doing what procurement advised.
Right. It's also right, isn't it, that after the medium risk and low risk FRA programmes came to an end, you didn't enter into a fresh contract with him for those programmes?
No, we didn't. Again, I would have taken advice, but again, I don't know where I've put it or what I've done with it. I wouldn't make those decisions, and I don't usually have much budgetary control, so I'm always really careful about making sure that I follow the rules.
No, but the factual position seems to be that there was a formal contract for the high risk programme with Salvage that came to an end, and a formal contract through a tender for the medium programme with Carl Stokes, and then it just all rolled into one ongoing understanding after that, undocumented and non-contractual.
Well, he was still operating to the contract,
right.
The terms of the contract. The low risk, I did take advice, and there is a document which I was told Sasha needed to sign and Carl needed to sign, and that's what I was required to do, which is just one sheet of paper, but that's the advice that I received, and we did have that in place. But yeah, he was always, whatever he was doing, he always was operating according to the original contract. That was always his understanding.
Yes. When I say non-contractual, I mean no fresh formal contract signed.
No, you're right.
To govern specifically that role. But your understanding, and indeed his, was that you were always operating together on the basis of the terms and conditions contained in the July 2010 consultants report for all properties.
Yes.
Yes. And was his continued instruction on that basis ever approved by anybody at the TMO?
No, I've discussed it with Barbara probably within maybe the first 6 months or a year of her joining, and I said, this is the situation, I think this needs to be looked at, and I think perhaps we're in a position where we now need to reprocure. And we were both mindful of the fact that Carl he didn't just undertake risk assessments, that he was able to offer us kind of advice and assistance. He'd assessed leaseholder doors. There was a range of other activities that he had undertaken on our instruction. So we had done some work to get together a sort of comprehensive list of those. So, in some cases he would assist with training. There were a variety of things. And I had spoken to, and I did find some documentation, Ernest Raw was one of my procurement colleagues, and I started to have discussions with him and set out the extent of the work. But I don't know where that had got to be honest. But we certainly had kicked it off, and Barbara was aware that we needed to get on and do some reprocurement.
Yeah, I mean, are you able to explain how it comes about that there was no formal contract with Carl Stokes for any of these programmes after 2012, in circumstances where the TMO was a pretty document-heavy organisation which liked to write everything down, so it seems?
I can't. I can only reiterate that I would have taken advice. There's no way we would have let that continue unless I'd been advised that was okay.
Right. How was his funding arranged? Now, let me put it a slightly different way. Did anybody approve the funding for Carl Stokes' work?
I don't actually know. I mean, his invoices came in. I was the one who checked that what he said he'd done was what he'd actually done. And I signed them off and gave them to finance, and I truthfully don't know how it was budgeted.
You don't know how it was budgeted?
No.
Right, okay. Now, can we go to your first witness statement, please? Page 31, paragraph 140. You say there in the third line, after having referred to the initial position with Mr. Stokes, you say, however, his role changed over time, and the default position became that if we had an issue that might be classified as a fire safety risk, more often than not we consulted CSA, Carl Stokes Associates. Now, when you say that you would consult with CSA for any issue that, quotes, might be classified as a fire safety risk, what did you mean by that?
I mean that, for example, he got involved in assessing potentially non-compliant leaseholder doors. We'd originally, I know it's quite a big area, but we had originally endeavoured to explain to leaseholders that the door was demised and was their responsibility.
If I just pause there,
sorry.
you may have misunderstood my question.
Sorry.
How would you create a class which would contain things like fire safety risks? What was the classification you used?
When things were referred to me, it was a range of things. It could be people with hoarding tendencies, where there is an elevated potential degree of risk. It could be things to do with mobility scooters. It could be very vulnerable residents. There were a variety of things. Anything that was referred to me that I felt I wanted to get a second opinion on from a specialist fire consultant, I would consider referring to Carl.
I see. And was this approach or process approved by the TMO board at any time?
Certainly in relation to the leaseholder doors, that was approved by the Health and Safety Committee, and I think also the Scrutiny Committee.
But this ad hoc approach in general of going to Carl Stokes whenever a so-called or potential fire safety risk arose, was that ever the subject of approval by the TMO board?
No, not explicitly. I think there was always an expectation that there would be things, and the same with Salvage, there would be things that came along that we would seek his advice on, because we didn't have sufficient detailed in-house fire safety advice, and that was part of the contract, really.
I mean, given that the TMO board was the board of the responsible person, was it not essential for the TMO board to know of and approve of those ad hoc arrangements?
Possibly. Well, I mean, all I can say is my line managers always knew the range of activities and sometimes it would be them who suggested that we get him involved in assessing or doing an activity-specific report, and that there was nothing coming back from the executive team to say, actually, we should set out the terms of this.
Did it ever occur to you to tell your line manager that the ad hoc arrangements that you had with Carl Stokes ought to be formally brought to the attention of the TMO board as the board of the responsible person and signed off?
I don't believe it did.
Why is that?
I can't give you an explanation. It should have done. I think the problem is sometimes whenever you have a really busy day job, you don't stand back and do the kind of thinking about, well, actually, that's the structure that you need to have in place. I can't give you an explanation.
Now, I want to turn to, last question. What about RBKC? To your knowledge, did RBKC ever sign off on Carl Stokes' ad hoc approach?
I don't believe they signed off on it, no. But I think they certainly were aware of his involvement, significant involvement in terms of leaseholder doors, because we also had some joint meetings with quite senior people at the fire brigade, and Carl and colleagues from RBKC were in attendance, so they were aware.
Now, I want to turn to the instructions given to Carl Stokes for completing the FRAs. Am I right in thinking that those were always contained in or could be found in the July 2010 consultant's brief that you'd sent him as part of the tender for the medium risk programme?
Yes.
Yes.
I believe so.
And once Mr. Stokes had been taken on by the TMO for the low risk FRA programme, were those instructions ever supplemented by any other written instructions?
I don't recall them being, no.
And what about when he was instructed on a rolling basis at the end of the low risk programme? Was he ever given any supplemental instructions? Or he just carried on?
Not that I recall.
Right.
Sorry.
So what were his instructions once he was carrying all three programmes on a rolling basis?
I would give him a programme with timescales for when things were due to be reviewed. He would come back and confirm that he could meet that. I would start. He knew the properties quite well by then. He knew the local caretakers. He had drop keys, so he could sometimes get his own access. He had their contact details. So those are the kinds of additional things that we were providing with him and updating him on a regular basis. But I don't really think about those as formal instructions. But we would be providing regular information. He would undertake, I believe, what. So when he first came to work for us, introduced him to colleagues in what was then, I think, building services, but became contract management. He would often go straight to them to ask them for documentation and certification in relation to plan maintenance, because he knew if he came through me, that was just an added tier of people. It made more sense to go straight to them. He would often pop in and collect the documentation. Providing he had the documentation before he went to site, then that would all be referred to in his assessment. He had a set of girder keys, so he could get into generally all the areas of the building. If there were areas that he couldn't access, he would initially try and contact the caretaker, the ESA, to provide access, or he would make sure they were outlined in his report. At the conclusion of that, when his report was finalised, I would receive it as a PDF document, and then I would receive a Word document with the action plan and significant findings.
Right. Now, when the LGA guidance was published in 2011, and when the PAS 79 guidance document was revised and published in August 2012, at either of those points, or after either of those points, did you ever send any instructions to Carl Stokes just to bring him up to date with the new publications and ensure, by way of instruction, that he complied with those?
We would have discussed them at length, particularly the LGA guide.
Right.
Because we had both been involved in the consultation that led up to it being finalised. He had his own input, and I think he also input some responses on our behalf. So we were both mindful that it was coming, and we were quite looking forward to it because we hoped it would be the most appropriate documentation for the majority of our blocks. So we would have talked at length about the LGA guide, but whether that translated into written instructions for him, I'm not sure.
Now, what about PAS 79, August 2012 edition? Did you ever have a conversation about that document?
Probably, but I can't specifically remember. Apologies.
I want to ask you some questions about the process and frequency of the production of FRAs. Can we go to the consultant's brief, please, at TMO 00842371? Page 6, Part 2, Paragraph 1.1, Scope. And it says, fire risk assessments will be undertaken and reviewed regularly at a frequency dictated by the degree of risk. The FRA and FRA reviews will include an individual examination of each communal fire door, including whether it operates correctly, and the findings will be clearly documented in each report. Do you recall how often high-risk buildings were reviewed once the initial programme with Salvage was completed in April 2010?
They would have been done by Carl. As you know, Grenfell Tower was done at, I think, December 2010. So I think the plan was that they would be done comprehensively every 3 years, unless there were material alterations or the other factors, and there would be a low-level review happening in between those periods.
Yes.
In reality, because we had Manse Master Door replacing doors and we had some major works in various locations, there were other factors which meant that reviews were undertaken at shorter intervals, more frequently.
Yes. I mean, you mentioned Grenfell Tower, December 2010. That's quite right, 29th of December 2010. Do you know why Carl Stokes produced an FRA in December 2010 for Grenfell Tower when he had produced one at Salvage on the 30th of September 2009?
I think that's what we referred to, that sort of snuck up on me, really, that we'd appointed him to do medium risk, he's getting on with the medium risk, and then I have a kind of crisis moment and go away and say to my colleagues in procurement and to my line manager, I'm in this position, I want us to do another comprehensive review by the consultant. Is this something that we can get on and do? And then he is in a position where he has to programme that in along with all of his other work. Right.
And what Mr. Stokes says in his statement, and this is paragraph 52 on page 17, we don't need to go to it, is that if he had done an FRA in a given year for a particular high-risk building, then it was intended that the FRA would be reviewed in-house by TMO the next year, and then he would undertake a fresh FRA the year after that. Do you agree with that?
It's right that we would get to the stage where we would review the FRA in-house the following year, but I believe at that stage, for high risk, we were looking to make sure they were done every 3 years, because the proposal in the redrafted fire strategy that didn't quite make it to be signed off was that we would review comprehensively every 2 years. So that was a change. So I think our original position was once every 3 years.
Right. So can you account for why Grenfell Tower, which was a high-risk building, I think, was redone with a fresh FRA only in December 2010?
Because that's what Salvage specified whenever they did their review.
Right, I see.
Yes?
Now, the concept of in-house reviews is repeated, I think, in your November 2013 fire safety strategy, isn't it?
Yes.
Let's go to that. TMO 00830-598, page 10, paragraph 14.3.3. And it says there, it is anticipated that this is halfway through the paragraph, it is anticipated that the shorter, more regular reviews, which will tend to concentrate primarily on progress with previous action plan and identification of any changes, will be carried out in-house by the TMO Health and Safety team. However, where completely new FRAs are required, either because of some criteria 2 to 4 apply, or on a recurring basis, the services of a specialist fire risk assessor will be used. So just to be clear, the regular reviews were not intended to be like fire risk assessments completed by Carl Stokes to Class 79 standards.
No, they weren't.
They're
were
monitoring
what we call
to
the
see
low-level review. Apologies.
Yeah, they're just monitoring to see that the actions are closed out.
Yes, and there are no obvious changes to the building. There's no evidence of arson or antisocial behaviour or any other areas which would lead you to think there's an elevated degree of risk, or any works on site where there might be hot works that we're unaware of, those kinds of issues.
I see. Now, Carl Stokes said in his evidence, and just for our purposes, it's day 136, page 148, lines 12 to 16. We can see it if you like, but he said that he would receive copies of something he called a health and safety tick sheet. Do you know, can you help me with that?
No.
What was that? You don't know?
I really don't know, sorry.
Right.
Because my colleague, when he was doing his reviews, would take out Carl's action plan, and we would add another column just to confirm that what we thought had been completed was completed, so that we had a record. And Carl wouldn't necessarily have that. And after that was done and we moved on to the next FRA, I'm not sure we would have necessarily kept it. So I don't think we'd have shared that with him. And
well, that leads to the next question.
Oh,
Did
right,
you
sorry.
send him the FRA action plans with that fourth column completed in them for his next FRA?
I don't recall that we did. We could have done, but I don't recall that we did, or that he requested them, because I think he was going to refer back to his original comprehensive assessment.
Now, going back to the question of scope, can we go back to the consultant's brief, please? TMO 00842-371, page 6, paragraph 1.1. And I've read you this before, the reference to communal fire doors. Can you explain what you expected to be documented in the report? Was it detail of each communal fire door, or just the fire doors that weren't operating correctly?
I expected the action plan and significant findings to identify anything that we needed to action. So where he assured me that he did a visual check of all of the doors in the block, obviously in terms of flat entrance doors, generally that would be from the outside unless he managed to get access, but communal doors he would inspect from both sides, inspect the closer, any strips or seals or any door furniture, any glazing, all of that, and he would identify anything that was defective or potentially non-compliant, and that would be documented in the action plan, and that would allow us to raise the appropriate order for the works to be undertaken.
Right. Now this document is July 2010. Can you just help me? Why were communal fire doors in particular singled out for special treatment in paragraph 1.1 of this document?
I suppose because they protect the means of escape, especially if there's a dedicated means of escape. Often communal fire doors are there to protect that. I can't say.
You don't know?
No, I don't know. I mean, the difficulty with this document, as I said before, is that it was put together involving other colleagues from the council, and I look at it now and I don't know which bits were put in by whom, but
Right.
certainly Alexis did quite a lot of it, and it may have been from him or me. I'm not sure.
I mean, do you remember any particular problem or concern arising at the time about communal fire doors, which would have meant that it should obtain such a special place in this specification of services?
No, not especially. Obviously, they were always crucial to maintain the means of escape. The caretakers were doing regular inspections, and we thought it was a very important and of the communal areas. So they're an important part of the communal area. So it's important that they're looked at. And in some blocks, they were subject to quite a lot of use, and so potentially they could have failed more often. So we wanted to be assured that they were being given the level of scrutiny that they should have had.
Now, can we just go back to your first witness statement then, please? Still on the question of scope, and look at paragraph 140 at page 31. You say there, 3 lines up from the bottom, Carl's remit was the common areas of properties only. However, he had a helpful nature and would often make comments on matters outside of this remit. What did you understand by the phrase common areas?
I suppose I understood it to mean the communal areas, the areas which were sort of authorised access only, so the plant areas, and obviously the specification, his documentation requires him to do a percentage of inspections of flat entrance doors. So he'll do all of the doors from the outside of the property, but he needed to try and gain access to a number of flat entrance doors so that we knew what they were like from the inside, and he could make a better judgment about whether they were compliant or not.
Right.
Sorry, the other thing about communal areas is I knew that he would indicate if there was any issues in terms of access to the block. I don't think that's technically included in the fire risk assessment, but I know that it's something that he would have identified.
I'm just focusing on that a little bit more. Can we go back to the July 2010 consultant's brief, please, at TMO 00842-371? And at paragraph 1, page 6, if we can go to page 6, you'll see at paragraph 1.3, it says, FRAs and reviews will focus on, and then there's a list of 8 items, and I'll show them to you there in detail. 1, the compartmentation of the building and any possible shortcomings with it. 2, the operation and adequacy of fire doors, including their fire resistance rating and smoke/fire seals. 3, adequacy of firefighting equipment. 4, adequacy of automatic detection system, extraction systems, sprinklers, dry risers, wet risers, etc. 5, assessment of the means of escape to include final exit doors and assessment of secondary means of escape, where present, and its appropriateness/viability, emergency lighting, signage, etc. 6, fitness for purpose of the building in relation to fire safety. 7, fire safety management systems and their recording procedures. 8, marking of fire detection and firefighting equipment, fire doors, including their fire resistance rating and smoke/fire seals, and compartmentation on floor plans provided by the client where possible, and in all other cases to be produced by the consultant. Symbols and other information marked up on the drawings will be the same as in HM Government Guides Fire Safety Risk Assessment. Now, was it your understanding that each of those instructions, or those instructions generally, included checking a sample of flat entrance doors?
Yes.
Do you know why the brief didn't say that specifically?
I don't. But it was always very clear from the outset of both contracts that was our expectation, and that's what was being done.
Do you know where this list came from?
Again, this was put together from a variety of people.
Right.
So I'm not clear, as I say, I'm not clear looking back which bits were me, which bits were Alexis.
Okay.
But it was a combination.
Did you have an idea of what kind of percentage of flat front doors should be sampled in a high-risk, high-rise block such as Grenfell Tower?
I actually couldn't find anywhere an indication of what would be good practice. I think I'm confident that I raised it with my peers in the London South East Fire Safety Group, and I think they were commonly doing 5 to 10%. So I think 5 to 10% was pretty standard in the sector, although some people perhaps doing significantly more. I think what I always wanted to be assured of is that where possible, all different door types were sampled, and ideally there were several samples of each, so we had a better indication of the condition of each.
Did the checks include checking both the inside and the outside of the door? In other words, to include the checking of self-closing devices, smoke seals, door furniture, and things like that?
That was my expectation, that where possible, access should be gained.
Did you discuss with Carl Stokes, once he won the medium-term programme under these terms and thereafter, because these terms continue to govern, how Carl Stokes would choose which flat entrance door to assess?
I did, and it was along the lines of what I've just stated, actually, that would want, where possible, where you can get access, I want you to get access to each door type, so that you can review it from inside and out, look at the closer, look at the door furniture, and then you might have access to a symbol on the door which gives you better clarification about what standard it met as well. And anything that was potentially non-compliant, definitely try and access that. But ideally, multiple versions of each different style of door.
Right. Did you ever tell him that he needed to sample 5 to 10% in order for it to be a representative sample?
I think I did. I mean, it's difficult because access, as we know, is an issue, and I suppose the smaller the block, the less doors you've got as your sample, and inevitably people are out during the day, at work, at school, whatever. So yes, I thought it was commonly sort of agreed between us that was what we were working towards.
Right. How would he gain access to tenants' flats?
He had an ID, and initially in the contract we had written articles in the Link magazine to advise that we were undertaking these and to encourage people to provide access and to explain why the access was required, obviously. And he would engage with people when he was in the block, explain what he was doing, and if they were happy to give him access, they would. He would door knock. If the caretaker, the ESA, was around, they might be able to suggest that this person's normally in through the day, or they might be able to attend with him, so that anybody who was concerned about security or whatever would be assured.
Right. Did you ever consider pre-arranging access for him to particular flats?
We did. Access is a perennial problem for housing providers, and we did consider it, but to be honest, we didn't go down that track. We've got very exacting requirements in terms of servicing gas appliances, and we've really struggled with that. Our compliance has been very good for many years, but it is a relentless process, and we've got a number of dedicated people who work exclusively on the access. So we didn't. Is to cut a long story short.
Okay. Did you ever agree with him how his inspections of flat front doors would be documented in his FRAs? I mean, for example, would he document every door that he inspected, or only the ones where he found problems?
Certainly, everywhere where there's a problem would need to be documented on the significant findings and action plan. I would expect that in the body of his report, where possible, he would at least say, I've been able to access 8 dwellings. And ideally, I would want him to put the flat numbers. But in truth, I can't recall if he did.
Well, I don't think he did. I mean, not in very many instances. My question then is, if he didn't document which doors he'd inspected, how would you or your team know in the following year with your FRA review, either in-house or later, which doors had been looked at?
We would know the doors which had been defective.
Yes, but what about those where no defects had been identified?
We wouldn't know that if he didn't report it.
Mr. Chairman, I'm really in the middle of the topic of scope, but I'm certainly not going to finish it by 4:30 because it is 4:30. So
Yes.
this is a natural moment to break.
I'm afraid it is,
where the
isn't
clock
it?
stands.
Otherwise, we shall be here for
Indeed.
a long time.
So I'm going to ask you to draw a line for the day.
Yes. Well, it is 4:30, Ms. Wray, and I think it's time we all stop for the day. So we're going to stop there. We'll resume, please, at 10 o'clock tomorrow. And again, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it overnight, all right?
Okay.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
10 o'clock tomorrow then, please.